Hello, and welcome to Chaotic Insights, where I break down the TV show Chaotic. Today we'll be describing and talking about episode 12, Battle of the Sexes. So grab a snack, start your laundry, and we'll dive right in. Episode summary, or some would even say the summary of the episode. So Peyton is walking around the chaotic grand room, saying hello to a lot of people. When Christella and Peyton get into a tiff, they decide to have a chaotic battle, male versus female. Tom arrives during the battle, and he's wondering what's going on. His comments prompt Sarah to tell the story about Interest and the Passage, where Interest defeats several underworlders and a growliter attempting to invade the overworld. When the story is complete, Peyton defeats Christella in the Battle of the Sexes. But there's a twist. Peyton was using the feminine presenting characters, and Christella was playing with the masculine presenting creatures. This leaves the crowd confused about who won the Battle of the Sexes. So, analysis. There is a pretty clear theme to this episode, and that is there is no winner to the Battle of the Sexes. Right? There is a winner to the chaotic battle, which is Peyton, but it's ambiguous, right? Who won the Battle of the Sexes? And the answer is nobody. So, it's purposely confusing, leaving the audience with more questions than answers. It's meant to be thought-provoking, it's meant to have the audience think about gender and sex and their own biases. So let's talk about terminology real quick. In this episode, they use language in an interchangeable way, which is not uncommon, but language has meaning and holds significance. So let's just lay some groundwork on terminology so that we can all have the same conversation. Sex refers to biological sex. It helps to describe chromosomal combinations and anatomy. Often it is the sex assigned at birth, right? Terms that describe sex are male, female, and intersex. Gender refers to socially constructed categories that describe an internal experience in a cultural context. So, some terms that describe gender in modern America are boy, girl, man, woman, or other non binary identities. Typically, people born male are socialized as boys, and typically, people born female are socialized as girls. Cisgender refers to somebody whose gender identity corresponds with their sex assigned at birth, in reference to that cultural dichotomy, right? So, for example, someone who identifies as a man and was assigned male at birth would be considered a cisgender man. Cisgendered can sometimes be shortened to just cis, and it is an adjective. So, adjectives describe nouns. So, for example, a cisgendered woman or a cis woman, the word cis describes the woman. So, the cis woman describes that the woman was also assigned female at birth, corresponding to that cultural dichotomy that I noted earlier. For reference sake, transgender would be the opposite of cisgender. Using the same example, a transgender woman, transgender describes woman, so it would be a woman who was assigned male at birth. Those are the terms that we're working with. So, of course, if you're interested, there are more terms, more concepts relating to gender and sex and gender roles and gender appearance and gender expression. But if you understand the difference between sex and gender, you should be prepared for the discussion that we're about to have. So, chaotic uses terms for sex and gender pretty interchangeably, which is a pretty common thing. But of course, now we know that words mean things. And so, using sex and gender in an interchangeable way normalizes conflating the two when they are different. They're different concepts. So, the vocabulary and social understanding of sex and gender has grown since 2007, but I would argue this episode is still rather progressive for April 14th, 2007. That's when the Wikipedia says this episode was released. However, these terms are used interchangeably in this episode, and that means that in this episode it assumes that everybody is cisgender, and it sends the message that you can assume somebody's sex or gender just based on what they look like. And of course we know that's not true. But this episode wants us to assume that the characters with their chests covered, or with long eyelashes or long hair are the girls, and it wants us to assume that characters with no shirt or no eyelashes or short hair are the boys. But you can't always tell based on what someone looks like. So when we are watching vignettes of these chaotic battles, we are meant to assume that the creature is a boy or a girl just based on their appearance, and therefore associate it with Peyton or Christella. And that's happening in universe, that's what the characters are doing too, but that's how the writers are purposely misleading their audience and creating a satisfying ending through the twist. It's relying on your cultural context to associate what a creature looks like with the gender and therefore the chaotic player playing that character. So it relies on your cultural assumption that A, the girl creatures have a feminine look, and that B is Christella is playing the feminine creatures. But ultimately, the writers toy with this battle of the sexes trope with the twist ending. And as a side note, one thing that we don't get in Chaotic is transgender representation, and that goes back to the representation conversation that we started earlier, but it's just something that we never get. So in this episode, of course, they are assuming that everybody is cisgender because we never see any examples of someone different. But let's not talk about the representation that we didn't get, and let's talk about what we did get. So the theme of this episode is that there is no winner to the battle of the genders, right? Or breaking it down more, they the objective of this episode is to express that neither boys or girls are inherently better, inherently have more value, right? If the characters are using the chaotic battle as a case study for which gender is better, they achieve the episode's objective by obscuring the results of the experiment. So the writers create a paradoxical conclusion of the battle for the audience. So Peyton, a man, beats Christella, a woman, using feminine presenting creatures who are assumed to be women, right? It creates a paradox of we assume that the women win the chaotic battle and the battle of the sexes, battle of the genders, if you will. But when it's revealed to be Peyton, a man using the feminine presenting creatures, it creates a paradox. Though the question presented seems to be incomplete. So the question presented is, are boys or girls better? But the question is incomplete. Better at what? What quantitative or qualitative metric are we measuring to make a conclusion that either boys or girls are better? So the case study results could say that boys are better chaotic players and girls are better chaotic creatures, but each side gets a point, so it's a tie. But because we're not measuring anything specific, it's easier to get vague results. And also, what they're measuring is inherent value, which we know, like, they come to the conclusion that neither one is inherently better, but measuring inherent value is a slippery slope. So they were slipping on that slope. Now, if Peyton used boy creatures in one, then they would be able to conclude that boys are better because Peyton used boy creatures and is a boy. But vice versa, if Christella won with girl creatures, they would have been able to conclude that girls are better because they're better players and better creatures. But even if that did happen, the logic would still be flawed because this is not a sample size large enough to draw any meaningful conclusions. We're getting scientific here. But let's examine the question though. Are boys better or are girls better? And this is actually a childish playground question, right? Even Sarah notes that. She goes, it's so second grade. And this isn't actually a question that adults ask. It's a question that children ask. Why? Because adults have already internalized an answer and have created bias. And so adults aren't asking this question because they have created bias already and even if they don't think they know the answer, they have an internalized answer to it. But bias is something that's taught, and that's what the target demographic of this TV show is children, so it feels like an appropriate topic to portray and explore. Thus, when the conclusion is presented that neither gender is inherently better than the other, it feels progressive, because the patriarchy benefits if you internalize that men are better. That helps the patriarchy. So deciding that men aren't better is a feminist message. Feminist meaning the movement that wants everybody to have same rights regardless of regardless of gender. So the question now is chaotic indoctrinating my kids? And the answer is no, because indoctrination is teaching a point of view without applying critical thinking skills to it. And so chaotic does not explicitly tell you that neither boys or girls are inherently better. They're not, preaching feminism in this episode. They present you with the paradoxical conclusion and rely on the audience to use their own critical thinking to synthesize what that conclusion means independently. The episode does have a point of view that they're explaining, but they are not pushing it onto anybody. That circles back to the point of the episode, which is to make you question your own bias. Did I think that boys were better? Did I think that girls were better? And now, after seeing this episode, can I come to the conclusion that they're the same? Both of them have inherent worth, and both of them have inherent value that don't need to be at odds. Both of them can have value and worth without being pitted against each other. So this episode does all that. All this exploration in the battle of the genders in a child appropriate way while amplifying a feminine creature's story interests. So they really pack a lot into this episode. Now, I want to talk about logistically how Peyton and Christella pull off this beautiful and insightful lesson that both boys and girls have inherent value and they don't need to be at odds, right? So the question is, how did they pull this off? Christella trips Peyton, provoking a challenge. And after that, the next thing we see is the creatures in battle. Now, do you think Peyton and Christella pre-planned the incident in the chaotic grand room? I would think not, right? I think Christella was annoyed with Peyton and acted upon it. Which leads us to an alternative that somewhere in between the conflict and the battledrome, they decided to pull some tomfoolery. There is a comment on the YouTube video. Now, I don't normally look at the comments on the YouTube videos, before I craft my thoughts and my script. I'm doing this pretty independently, but as an exception, I took a little peek, and there was a comment on the YouTube video that reads, "Seems like Christella was baiting Peyton, thinking he'd be at a disadvantage using only female creatures." And I kind of like this take, even though it's just a headcanon, because it places internalized misogyny inside Christella, who is our reoccurring antagonist, and thereby villainizes the internalized misogyny. Right, but who's to say that it wasn't Peyton's idea? Because Peyton's whole thing is unexpected, so maybe he wanted to create chaos and confusion, and Christella decided to play along for those reasons. Now there's another comment I also like that reads, "The chaotic players who were watching the match quickly realized the plot twist off screen, but as Tom, Kaz, and Sarah were too busy talking to each other, they were chit-chatting, they didn't realize it. So the others probably realized off screen and decided to stop watching the match when the main three were surprised at the outcome. Everybody else in the background were minding their own business." Now, I kind of butchered reading this comment, so you can read it yourself. Now, I like this because if you conflate what we see as an audience with what is being shown on the TVs at Chaotic, then you have to conclude that the Codemasters would also be in on this bid. And somehow he impacted the editing of the live gameplay that was shown in the Chaotic live stream grand room. Or you would have to conclude that normally they don't show the players choosing their decks, which we all know is untrue because in past episodes we get characters calling in while they're building their decks. So ultimately the episode is built with this twist in mind, and so they purposely omit information that will lead you to the twist. So they rely on your understanding of the show format and the cultural expectations that you have to guide you through the battle. so that when they finally do deliver the information, it contrasts with the assumptions that you built in your head. Also, this episode kind of confirms that we, as an audience, do not have an omniscient point of view as an audience member. We are guided through the world typically through a character's point of view, right? We start this episode with Peyton, and then we switch to Tom's perspective, and then we get the interest story through Sarah's perspective. All that to say, the episode is crafted in a way to lead you in one direction so that they can successfully pull a twist. We don't have voiceover narrations of this player versus this player, and we don't see the characters touch the screen and transform. And that's the understanding of the show format, that we're 12 episodes in, they understand that you understand how the game works, and so you can still follow the story when they omit those pieces of information that would tell you who's playing which character. Let's talk about our other storyline now. Our other storyline is interest, which completely interrupts the battle that we are seeing, and we trust Sarah to be a reliable narrator for this local legend, for this local myth of interest. The two plotlines of this episode do not overlap like whatsoever. They fully complete the interest story before returning back to the battle for a conclusion twist ending. I think this could be because, as we were talking about, they have to purposely omit information to preserve the twist, which robs the storytellers of the shorthand they need to switch in and out of the battle. I think another question to ask would be, why did they pair the interest story with the gender battle plot? Does highlighting a powerful creature build a better case towards that gender? They're highlighting interest, who is a feminine presenting creature. Is that building a case towards girls being better? And they might intentionally be doing this because as we see the feminine presenting creatures win the battle, so showcasing a powerful feminine presenting creature helps build the case in that direction. Furthermore, pushing you as an audience member into that assumption before they pull the twist. But so far we haven't seen that many feminine creatures. Really, Takinam has been the only one with any major highlights, and we have Sarah and Christella being our only active players that we have interacted with. But introducing interest is a step towards balancing the scales. It comes nowhere close to evening them out, right? We have so many masculine presenting creatures, and so introducing interest as this powerful feminine presenting creature, it's a step in a direction of balancing the scales, but it doesn't balance them at all. It is being very intentional about highlighting a powerful feminine creature. It feels like an olive branch to girls at home watching. It is an intentional move towards making an underrepresented gender feel like they are welcome in chaotic spaces, right? They're being underrepresented because what I counted for Sarah, Christella, Takinam have been our major feminine presenting characters so far, so they're being underrepresented. But it feels like an olive branch. It feels like an intentional move towards inclusion. And how that is received by women watching the show, I don't know. I don't know. But it seems like Chaotic is making a definitive effort towards their inclusion, towards that demographic. And one thing I like about this episode is that it doesn't really lean into misogyny. Sure, they take jabs at both sides, like Christella throws some stereotypes about men at Peyton, or Tom being surprised at how good the feminine presenting creatures are. They're taking jabs at either side. But the debate doesn't lean into it. Nobody tries to justify their argument by using stereotypes or gender roles or cultural experiences. They keep it to this childlike debate. The writers, they don't make it more complex or more adult than it has to be. Tom is rooting for Peyton because he doesn't like Christella, and not because he's trying to justify his masculinity. And Christella roasts Peyton at the beginning, which is very Santana from Glee, but it is intentionally rude, while remaining somewhat in the realm of accuracy. So let's break it down. She calls him a testosterone challenged, which is just rude because we don't know anything about Peyton's testosterone levels, but a self-deluded grade A geek with less than zero fashion sense, right? That's kind of a read. Self-diluted, he was just going around talking to everybody, having an ego. Grade A geek, everybody is, they're chaotic players, with zero fashion sense. He wears the same outfit every day. Let's talk about it. And then also, acting like he knows everybody and everything, what was he just doing? We see it happen. And then this is where they throw in a stereotype of this is your typical all mouth, no brains male, right? And then Peyton refutes back with the broomstick reference again because she wears her dark colors and has a disdainful personality. He really likes this witch analogy, which, I have thoughts about. But ultimately, the writers strike a nice balance between real and thought-provoking and easy to understand for the youth, right? Peyton having an ego is real in this world because he has that level of self-confidence, and Christella's just pointing it out. Thought-provoking questions, you know, is this all-mouth, no-brain male something that is true, or is that something we have to question? It is something that we have to question, especially since it's coming from Christella. So ultimately, this episode strikes a nice balance of not using too much misogyny with a feminist message, with like having a point of view that's not overbearing and pushy, and allows the audience to come to their own conclusions. To use the evidence provided in the episode to conclude that neither gender is inherently better. And so, let me know if that's what you got from this episode. I am I'm interested in the way this episode is perceived because of the way it's set up. Right? When you watch it again, upon second viewing, you understand that there's a twist coming and you can point out the narrative techniques that they use to direct you towards a twist. And so much of that is just your cultural associations. And in addition to like omitting information of who's playing with what deck and all that. So I'm interested to see how you perceive this episode. On to lore. So we get lore about the passage, which is a stairway in a humongous volcano crater that connects the overworld and the underworld. We also get that the underworld guards the bottom of the passage and the overworld guards the top. Both Interest and Zalek have shifts guarding the passage, and we also learn that Zalek has been through a lot worse than this kerfuffle that we see on screen, implying that there have been other recent conflicts and that Interest and Zalek have been involved in other battles. We also get the introduction of new technology, so we get a Kaor hologram in the Growlither, which is pretty cool. It seems to be a param communication device, presumably like a phone, like a visual storytelling technique to communicate long distance communication. And then we also get the new technology of the Growlither, which is like an insect tank. And this may be the first time we see Kaibon like as a character with lines. I'm not fully sure about that, but that's what my heart is telling me. And one thing about Kaibon, when I think about Chaotic, I more often think about him as the underworld inventor, but he's more like the mechanic, and Almar is more like the mad scientist. So they're both related to invention and technology in the underworld. But we see Kaibon piloting this insect tank. At the end of the battle, Peyton says that Christella was a tough battle, which validates Christella as a good chaotic player. And we've only seen Peyton play twice chaotic battles, but he's won both times. So Peyton has a good reputation as a chaotic player, and so Peyton calling Christella a good chaotic player also validates her as a good chaotic player, and that was a tough battle for him. And so those are the lore bits that we get. We get the passage, we get these two pieces of new technology, and then we get justification that both Peyton and Christella are good chaotic players. Now on to fun facts. My favorite line of the episode is, "I can't let her insult my mother like that." And then Kaz is like, she didn't insult your mother. And he says, if she heard what she's Ed, trust me, she'd be insulted. Hilarious, clever, comedy. One other thing, Interest said Therax in this episode. In the Yakuza episode, I went on a tangent about if it was Thorax or Therax, and I had decided that it was Thorax, but Inter said Therax. Therax? Therax. And so that might be the correct pronunciation. Maybe there's regional dialects in Chaotic, we don't know. Another fun fact or other note, this is the first time we see flirting at Chaotic, which I think is pretty rare in the show. When Peyton and I think Chaotic Cutie, little flirtatious moment there. What happened in the Glue Monk swamp? I would like to know. So those are my other notes. Not a whole lot of other notes, but I do think the focal point of this episode relies on gender exploration. So my final thoughts are, I like this episode. I think the interest story is fine, but I do think the twists and turns that come with the conclusion of the episode make it memorable. This is one of the most memorable chaotic episodes for me in that I just think it's such a hallmark episode of chaotic, and it goes to show how chaotic is attempting to be progressive in this children's cartoon by portraying a feminist message that both men and women are equal. And I think it's nice to see a cartoon using their platform for good, for you know, sneaking educational aspects into entertainment in a way that's not educational, right? We use media as education for culture and for society and for societal norms. And so if chaotic is normalizing that gender equality is good, I think that's good. And I think that's what I have to say about that. It's, is it my favorite episode narratively from a story perspective? Not necessarily, but I just think it's so memorable and iconic. This is iconic. This is a iconic chaotic episode. Like if I were to show my friends an episode to be like, why do you like chaotic so much? I don't know if I would start with this episode, but this would be in my first batch of this is why I like chaotic is because it's fantasy it's fantasy wrestling mixed with good social messaging. So, yeah, and that rhymes. Fantasy wrestling mixed with good social messaging. And complex and compact storytelling. I don't know. I think it's fascinating and once you make art, it leaves the artist and it's up for the audience to decide if it's good art or not. And that's the point of this episode is to leave you with questions. And so, as a kid, you watch this episode and you're like, oh my gosh, twist ending. And you do have to marinate about that. Your subconscious is working. And I don't know. It just, I think it's iconic. So, with that, thanks for watching and I'll see you next time.